let's hope I'm smart enough to answer all your questions. We'll see.
Yeah. All
I
right.
gotta
So
say, by the way, I love the name Bentham's Bulldog. I really feel that too often people dunk on utilitarianism. I guess it's quite fashionable in philosophical circles or even outside of that to, paint this very silly and shallow view of what utilitarianism is, even though it actually, in my view, has the best track record of all, you know, uh, branches of moral philosophy. You read Immanuel Kant today, and
yeah,
a lot of it
yeah,
hasn't
no, I
aged all that well, especially the commandment not to masturbate. But
yeah,
like Bentham, he was on the right side of history in so many respects.
yeah. No, I completely agree. Like you look at the things that the early utilitarians got right, where uh, Bentham was writing in 1798 about the permissibility of homosexuality, and you compare
Mm-hmm.
that to Kant, who my favorite instance of Kant just saying something just completely outrageous was he was talking about some fellow named I think Father Labat. He was saying, this person he was talking about he was talking about mistreating women, and he was like, this Father Labat guy, the stuff about mistreating women, I thought he was on track about that. But then I realized, he was quite black from head to foot, which is sure proof that what he says is stupid. So it's like, I would have been on board with the sexism, but the guy who was saying it is black, so it must not be correct.
Whoa. Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah. So much happening there.
yeah. All right, so I'm here with Rutger Bregman. Rutger Bregman is a Dutch popular historian and author. He has published various books on history, philosophy, and economics, including Utopia for Realists, How We Can Build the Ideal World, which has been translated into 32 languages. His work has been featured in The Washington Post, The Guardian, and the BBC. He's been described by The Guardian as the Dutch wunderkind of new ideas, and by TED Talks as one of Europe's most prominent young thinkers. And so I primarily have him here to discuss his new book, Moral Ambition, which just came out very recently. So Rutger, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Matthew. Looking forward to this.
So, a brief question, just like what in essence is your book about? I assume moral ambition, well, I've read the book, but I assume viewers are guessing it's going to be about some moral ambition of some sort. But, what's the main focus of the book?
Yeah, so we have very big problems. 15,000 kids dying from easily preventable disease every day. Next pandemic that may be around the corner, the moral atrocity of factory farming, existential risks, nuclear war, risks of AI, democracy collapsing. A lot of work to do. Okay, that's observation number one. Observation number two is that if you want to fix those problems, you need people, and preferably very talented people. Then you go and look, what are those people doing? And very often they're not working on those very big problems. Instead, they're working for, I don't know, McKinsey, big banks. They're building startups to sell us more stuff we don't need to impress people we don't like. So yes, there's this mismatch. An economist would say there's a massive misallocation of talent. And moral ambition is about using what you have. So that's in the first place your precious time on this planet and your talent, but could also be your cultural capital, could be for your financial capital. And using it to make this world a wildly better place. Very often when people say they want to do good, they say, let's make the world a little better, right? Which is always annoys the heck out of me. It's like, why a little? Why not much? So yeah, that's what moral ambition is.
Yeah. So suppose that a person, they say, look, I'm on board, I want to do good. I want to take a morally ambitious career. Many of the careers that people are currently planning to take are in, like finance and, these careers that you think are not very morally ambitious. So what are some careers that you think are high impact that you think a morally ambitious person might want to take?
I mean, it could be many, many different kinds of careers, obviously. We need entrepreneurs, we need lobbyists, we need activists. In my view, there's a whole toolbox, and it just depends what problem you're trying to tackle. So just to give you an example, I've co-founded an organization called the School for Moral Ambition. We started in Europe a bit more than a year ago. And initially, we chose two cause areas to focus on. One was accelerating transition towards sustainable proteins, because that's both the most neglected aspect in the fight against climate change. It's 20% of emissions. And it's also connected to this terrible moral atrocity that we just talked about, this immense suffering of billions of animals. At the same time, we chose to work on fighting big tobacco, this was a big surprise for me, but our researchers pointed this out to us, that this is the single largest preventable cause of disease still in the world today, 8 million deaths. And if you look at places like Brussels, you see a super powerful lobby from big tobacco and almost nothing standing in the way. Now, these two cause areas are very different. So we realized we needed very different people to go and work for this. So for the food thing, which is obviously a quite sensitive topic, gets polarized very quickly, we needed coalition builders. We needed people who were very skilled at lobbying or influencing policy. But for the tobacco thing, we realized that one of the main things that was lacking here was just awareness. People are not angry enough at big tobacco. So for that cause area, we started recruiting some marketeers, for example. We've got one person actually in our first cohort who used to work for big tobacco. So yeah, she knows a thing or two about how to build an evil and effective campaign. So that's the way I would look at it. It just depends on your skill set. And moral ambition is about finding the match between, on the one hand, some of those very big problems, and then on the other hand, yeah, what you can bring to the table.
Yeah, regarding tobacco, during my freshman year of college, I was taking a class that was about, topics sort of related to effective altruism. The topic was changing the world. It was about how to do good effectively. And I remember at one point, the professor asked us to rank different causes of death, how much we thought, which things we thought killed different numbers of people. And, one of them was war, one of them was tobacco. And so, of course, everyone thought war kills way more people than tobacco. And then it just turns out that tobacco kills many, many, many times more people than war. Like, I think literally orders of magnitude more. And yeah, I remember being pretty shocked by that. It's just 8 million deaths a year. I mean, it's just utterly staggering. And, people, because tobacco is less common in wealthier countries, and now has primarily surged in middle income countries, people don't realize just how much of a horrifying killer it is.
And look, I do think that there's a difference between someone dying in a war and someone, who starts smoking and then dies, I don't know, 10 years on average, I think, earlier than if you wouldn't have smoked your whole life. So there's a difference there. But even taking that into account, the numbers are indeed enormous. I have this one analogy in an essay that I wrote about this, comparing it to jumbo jets crashing, and a fully loaded jumbo jet. I think it carries around 400, 500 people. And so we're talking about the equivalent of a jumbo jet crashing every 30 minutes for 365 days a year, 24 hours every day. And it just keeps going on. Like, that's the tobacco industry, and very little people are doing anything about it. Yeah, that was a big surprise for me. But it's also a part, I think, of being morally ambitious, is that you don't start with your own passion, but you start with listening to people who thought long and hard about what some of the biggest problems actually are. And you already mentioned effective altruism. That's absolutely something we've learned from our effective altruist friends.
Yeah. So one of the things that you talk about is, so you talk in the book about the failure of traditional left-wing activist movements, and in particular those people who are called woke. And what you say is that they often talk a good talk about doing good in the world, but then they often tend not to achieve much. Where they focus to a great degree about being quite moralistic about speech, but then they rarely try to take significant actions to better the world. And this is a similar concern that I've had about many on the left. They seem, often to be quite concerned about how people talk, about the discourse that people use, but much less concerned about high impact efforts to dramatically better the world. They seem to care much less about whether people are, say, donating to anti-malarial bed nets, which save large numbers of lives, than if people are, using words correctly. I'd be curious, why do you think this tendency is so widespread? Why do so many people treat speech and discourse as so much more important than actually acting in the world and doing good productively?
Well, the first answer that comes to mind is that building is much more difficult. It's a lot more work than posting on Instagram or on Twitter. Yeah, I mean, I'm not the expert here. I don't have some deep layered psychological or historical explanation why this keeps happening. But indeed, it's something that annoys the hell out of me. I am a guy who comes from the political left, and this was actually something that I really appreciated when I first attended an effective altruism conference, because I always spent my time in leftist circles, and I shared, leftist ideals about the importance of fighting inequality and taxing the billionaires and building a movement, etc. But I always had this nagging feeling, but like, when are we going to do something, right? And it's not that people aren't doing anything. And I do think that there's a value in spreading awareness, and there's an enormous amount of value in protesting. I think that sometimes people in the center of the political spectrum or on the right, they like to say like, oh, if Extinction Rebellion was ineffective or something like that. I don't think that's true at all. I think many of those movements were actually quite effective, but we can talk more about that later. At the same time, yeah, very often there's a lot of talk and little action. And then you attend an EA conference, and you meet all these people, who've donated their kidneys to random strangers and who are giving a substantial amount of money away to effective charities. And it's like, hey, but this is awesome. Can't we have more of this? Actually practicing what you preach, and not just talking about systemic change, but doing your part and being a member of, as Margaret Mead would say, a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens that wants to change the world. So I guess I agree with your analysis that very often what you see is a lot of virtue signaling, and sadly also a huge amount of eternal policing. On the other hand, though, I am optimistic that we have now passed that era. I think the worst of it was probably in 2021, 2022, the pandemic. And I think that cancel culture is not nearly as powerful as it used to be, at least not in leftist circles. Now it's very much a right-wing phenomenon. It's the US government.
If you say the wrong stuff about Israel, and you're here on a visa, you're liable to potentially be deported.
Yeah, like me, like I did yesterday. I am on a visa and I said the wrong thing about Israel.
Well, good luck. Hopefully you don't get deported. I'm also, politically on the left, but I when I hear, left-wing criticisms of effective altruism, I tend to be irritated by them, because it tends to be like EAs are actually, going out in the world, doing things, saving large numbers of lives. And then you look at the criticisms that are raised, and they tend to be about, the political views EAs happen to have or allegedly have. Normally, these are often imagined political views that EAs don't actually have.
Mm-hmm.
EAs tend to be left of center, or things about the way EAs talk. And it just feels like, we should care more about what the people are doing, whether people are, going out in the world doing good stuff, than, whether the way they're speaking about things would pass muster at a leftist book club.
Can I push back a little bit against that? So on the one hand, I mean, as I said, I agree with that point. It's very refreshing to actually see people practicing what they preach. On the other hand, there was also this nagging feeling I had when I first encountered some of the people involved in the effective altruism movement, especially when I first heard about earning to give, for example. And this is now more than a decade ago. I think it was Dylan Matthews who wrote about it in the Washington Post at the time. And I instantly disliked it. I was like, okay, here you have a bunch of finance bros stealing from the poor to give it to the extremely poor. I don't know. I'm not enough of a utilitarian to like that. And there are many possible takeaways, obviously, of the Sam Bankman-Fried saga. But yeah, there was a certain utilitarian hubris maybe at the heart of that. Not saying like Sam was this big utilitarian, but there are a lot of humbling lessons probably to learn there, as I think many effective altruists would agree with me. And the other thing is that I do not think it's a coincidence that EAs rarely talk about about things that are more controversial for the billionaires who are financing them. And for me, the most obvious example is tax justice or tax fairness. I mean, we can have a discussion about, is this really the biggest global problem? I would argue it's very much a big problem. I think it's also one of the reasons our democracies are in trouble right now. And I think it's also quite tractable, actually. I think especially, a bunch of very brilliant, professionals who are maybe currently stuck at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs could do an enormous amount of good in this cause area, because we have a lot of awareness there, but too little action, and very often too little expertise. But then you look for tax fairness or tax evasion or tax avoidance on the AA forum, and there are like only a couple of blog posts about it, and they get little traction. And yeah, I tend to think that there's probably a reason for that. Like, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, or it's just not really part of your aesthetics. You just don't really. Sometimes that can happen as well, I think. I think many EAs instinctively would say, yeah, something like Extinction Rebellion, that's ineffective. And then you have a great think tank like Social Change Lab that was incubated by charity entrepreneurship. And I think they've done some good research showing that, well, actually, it seems to be quite effective. Maybe even a very cost-effective way of getting rid of your money, just donating it to Extinction Rebellion. And I think just, again, instinctively, there's something about EA's demographic that, for most of them, yeah, it wouldn't sit very well with them. Which you could also argue, like, that's fine. Like, there are different roles to play in a whole ecosystem. So EA maybe just got to be what EA is. But I do think that there is some truth and some value in, the leftist criticisms of effective altruism.
Yeah. So I am sympathetic. Like, I don't find all criticisms of EA to be unreasonable. I was just saying, I find, many of the criticisms raised, like, sort of when I read op-eds written by left-wing people, I tend to come away irritated. Regarding, the more specific points you brought up about, like, tax policy. So there, I would be a bit dubious about exactly how tractable it would be. Like, the modern Republican Party is very opposed to tax reform. And it tends to be pretty difficult to get substantial political reform passed when one of the major political parties is strongly against it. The most effective kinds of reform, insofar as they involve, it tends to be pretty hard to influence the political system. And if you are influencing the political system, if there's a very, very powerful lobby and constituency on the other side, then it tends to take a lot of work. And so then, insofar as they, pushed really hard for tax reforms, I'd be sympathetic to the idea that, I think support higher taxes on billionaires. But even if there were higher taxes, I'd be pretty doubtful that there would be like a cheap, effective way of increasing the probability of taxes taxes being able to be collected. Now, maybe there are like some ways that they could do it that would be high impact, right? So maybe like there would be ways of closing some particularly like egregious loopholes. I'd sort of have to see the math on it to see.
Yeah. Look, that's why I think like EA's just got to be EA, because I think this is a really valuable approach. I really would not want to live in a world where everyone takes this approach, but I think on the margins we want to have quite a bit of that, and maybe even quite a bit more. One thing I really agree with, that there's so much lazy journalism about effective altruism. When people say like, "Oh, Elon Musk is an effective altruism, therefore it's evil," like, oh my God, you've not done any research at all. So that's annoying. Again, one other point to push back a little bit. Imagine if in the late 60s and the early 70s, the right wingers came together, and there was just the Powell Memorandum, for example, which was the famous memorandum written by Lewis Powell, who was on the board of Philip Morris at the time, but had this plan for the complete corporate takeover of America, and out of that came the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society and blah, blah, blah. Imagine if a couple of right-wing effective altruists were at that meeting. I think it was at Disney World in the early 70s, saying, yeah, that doesn't seem super tractable to me. Everyone's leftist these days. It's all the ideas of John Maynard Keynes that are, that everyone believes in. Then someone could say, come on, we got to be a bit more ambitious. This is going to be a generational project. It's going to last for many decades. So that's sometimes the feeling I have when EAs are like, yeah, I'm not sure how tractable it is. I don't see what the clear metrics are. I'm like, yeah, it's going to take like 30 years probably to do this properly. But you need that level of ambition. And very often, I see that, like, especially in American political history, like the fight to take down Roe v. Wade, that took them 30 years or something. The Alliance for Defending Freedom got started in the early 90s. They recruited like 5,000 lawyers, a whole ecosystem of people that launched so many lawsuits. So if like maybe a more EA-ish kind of person would say like, oh no, let's not get started on that. We can spend that on BetNet.
Yeah, so I think it's true that there are cases where small groups have pushed for ambitious political projects and have managed to pass them. But it tends to be that when an ambitious political project is enacted, it's rarely attributable to the actions of a fairly small group of people. Like, while they're a group of particularly zealous activists and lawyers who are pushing for overturning Roe v. Wade, like there aren't a small number of people who can be credited with it. Really, it's a broader push from the Republican Party. The fact that the Republican Party has been a pro-life party for quite a while, and so you've had them be looking for it. So I don't know exactly how many effective altruists there are. I think there are. I mean, and it depends on exactly how you count effective altruists. But the number of people who have signed the Giving What They Can pledge is, I think, a few thousand. And so together, these people have saved, I think the number is, hundreds of thousands of lives. They've improved the conditions across multiple states for many hundreds of millions of factory farmed animals. If you count shrimp, then it's billions of animals who have been directly benefited. They've done various things to potentially safeguard the far future. And then you compare that to how much good they could have done if they'd sort of like joined the political fight and attempted to push for some political agenda. And I don't know, it seems much more doubtful that they could have had as much impact as they have had.
And they've accelerated the advance of AI that's now going to kill us all, right?
I think overall, we're better off, maybe because of EA's actions on AI.
Look, that is above my pay grade. But look, you don't have to convince me here. I totally agree. It's super inspirational to have this movement of people. It's indeed very small. Gets a lot of flack and criticism just because I think it's making people uncomfortable by actually doing stuff. And obviously it's a bit weird, with making all these funny calculations in qualis and dalis. But yeah, I've really come to love many people in this movement, even though it's not really for me. Like my brain doesn't work that way. I do recognize some basic principles. Like, for example, it's important to count. If you help more people, that's better. Like more is more. Seems to be an important ethical principle, which, by the way, you don't really have to be utilitarian. I mean, you can be, a big follower of Kant and still recognize that if you have a choice to saving, like you can save one life or two, like probably two is better, right? You're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah. A philosopher friend of mine has an article called Beneficentrism, where the idea is like, lots of people, they have many objections to utilitarianism. There's this much less controversial idea, which is the only thing you'll need for EA to be a good idea, which is just that it's really important to do good, and we should try to do more good rather than less. And I think really that's all you need to think that at least the core philosophy behind it is right, even if you have some disagreements about the margins. Right. Okay. So we've been talking a decent amount about EA. So I'd be curious, how is moral ambition, and does the broader kind of moral ambition project, how does it differ from effective altruism?
So as you know, the book is a study of a lot of movements. I talk a lot about the abolitionists. I talk a lot about the suffragettes who fought for the women's right to vote. I talk about the animal rights movement, the civil rights movement, and I also talk about effective altruism. And I would say that what we're building at the School for Moral Ambition is just, how do you say that? We're shamelessly plagiarizing all the stuff that we like from all these different movements. I talk extensively about Nader's Raiders, this movement around Ralph Nader in the 60s and the 70s. That is a huge inspiration to us, and that actually we're going to try and replicate at some of the most prestigious universities in the US, trying to make sure that all these brilliant people don't end up in what a friend of mine calls the Bermuda Triangle of talent: consultancy, finance, and corporate law. Yes, absolutely. Effective altruism was also a movement we looked at quite extensively, and that we have learned a lot from. So to make this a bit more personal, what happened to me when I first heard about effective altruism, I already told you, I was not super enthusiastic, like earning to give. I didn't like that. And then basically plugged out, but was still a little bit connected to the movement because, as you probably know, I was writing about universal basic income at the time. And a lot of people who are interested in UBI were also interested in EA. Like I already mentioned, Dylan Matthews, but also some of the people prominent in EA in the Netherlands. Like the big UBI guy in the Netherlands is a guy called Sher Hoeijmakers, and he later ended up becoming a more prominent effective altruist in the Netherlands. So there was like, I don't know, demographically there was some kind of overlap. So that's why I was still following what was happening in that movement. But it was what was really the moment when I got really interested into EA again was when my book started selling really well. So at some point I had sold 2 million books and made quite some money. And I had never had that ambition. I was always like, I'm probably going to end up as a history teacher. I honestly never been very interested in money my whole life. Like I don't have many material desires. And I realized that the only thing I was spending more money on was takeout food and cabs. But I couldn't really, I didn't really know what to do with this. And then I realized, hey, there was this movement that was really interested in this question, like how do you give your money away effectively? So I started doing the research and became a member of Giving What We Can, reached out to a couple of Dutch EAs, became friends with them, and then very quickly realized that, again, sort of like almost like culturally vibes based, this is not my movement. Like I couldn't take most of my friends probably to an EA conference because it's a bit too weird, if you get what I mean. But at the same time, I started becoming more and more excited about the idea of building something that also cares deeply about doing a lot of good, but that will appeal to a more mainstream audience. Because that's my job, right? As you rightly said at the beginning, I'm a historian, but I'm a popular historian, right? I write books for a bigger audience. That's my expertise. That's what I love doing. To combine, historical scholarship with storytelling craft that I think I've gotten better at over the years. So yeah, that's when this idea started developing in my head of, can I use my platform to add something here, to take some of the ideas around all these movements that I studied. And again, abolitionism was, especially British abolitionism, was probably the greatest inspiration for me, even bigger than effective altruism. And yeah, that's how we ended up there.
Yeah, my sense of moral ambition is it's sort of like, it's like EA, but a little bit more left wing, a little bit more systemic, and a little bit more sort of normal, less kind of insane and nerdy, and more like focusing on stuff that's of high public priority, but not as weird. So maybe a bit less focus on like shrimp welfare.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I love the shrimp welfare people, by the way. They're awesome. Yeah. And I think that's a fair summary. What would I add there? Well, I've said this before. I love making these historical comparisons, obviously. And when I studied the British abolitionist movement, well, you quickly discover that the Quakers were incredibly important. This weird Protestant radical sect of people who deeply believed in the inherent equality of all human beings, male, female, black and white. They were the first people who really came out as abolitionists, but initially they were mainly obsessed with themselves, just like many vegans today are mostly obsessed with themselves and policing each other. And they didn't get much done for a very long time, up until the 1770s and 80s. And Christopher Leslie Brown has written the book about this, Moral Capital, when they became part of one of the most successful movements for human rights in all world history. Probably the first time, as the historian Adam Hochschild argues, that hundreds of thousands of people started advocating for different people's rights instead of their own rights. And what was really essential here is that they built a coalition with the Evangelicals. And the Evangelicals, I mean, the most famous one was William Wilberforce. He later got all the credit, in many respects, undeservedly. Yeah, they were more mainstream. They had these mass gatherings. They were quite charismatic. They had good PR and marketing, you could say. And the Quakers didn't have that. Now, was that a problem with the Quakers? No, the Quakers should just be the Quakers, right? They actually supplied a lot of the brain power of the abolitionist movement and a lot of the financial power as well. But they couldn't do it on their own. So if you look at the British Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, it had 12 founders. 9 were Quakers, and these were all entrepreneurs. So all people who made significant amounts of money and put a lot of that money into the movement. But they also needed Granville Sharp, who was, a traditional Anglican. They needed Thomas Clarkson, who was also an Anglican, and became sort of the spokesperson for the whole movement. You couldn't have a Quaker as the spokesperson, right? Because the Quaker would be, too weird. You couldn't have the Quaker on CNN. So I guess you see where I'm going with this. We need something next to EA, right?
So EA are the Quakers, and you need
maybe that's an analogy that works.
You're the mainstream evangelicals.
Yeah. Maybe I should also say that there are parts of EA that I deeply love, like the giving what we can, charity, entrepreneurship, people, and maybe because I know them less well, but also because I've seen some nasty stories about them in the press. Maybe the whole Bay Area world of, I don't know, taking things a bit too far. Maybe that's the thing. EA is about merging altruism with rationalism, and I love the EAs for whom altruism is the most important thing, and then rationalism is attached on top of that. But you also have EAs who are mostly rationalists, and then are like, I mean, you got to do something with those super brains of mine, so let's apply it to helping people. But that was never their core motivation. And the people I trust immensely are the people who are mainly about doing good and then also happen to be smart, instead of the other way around.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that is a pretty good summary of the differences. I think it's funny that your movement is, compared to American evangelicals. Probably, or sorry, not American evangelicals, to evangelicals.
I mean, evangelicals today, what they do, they're on television, ripping people up. So something's gone wrong there. But yes, like for example, making sure that you look good, that your storytelling is sound. This was quite an epiphany for me when I studied the life of someone like William Wilberforce, or just the success of the abolitionists in general, just how popular they were, how much people wanted to be associated with them. Like, for example, it was the first massive consumer boycott in Western history, when hundreds of thousands of British people refused to put sugar in their tea. It was like virtue signaling gone wild. And that was not about the direct impact. Actually, it had no effect on the sugar price whatsoever, because people were still consuming enormous amounts of sugar anyway. No, it was about the political value of that, and then about the pressure it put on Parliament to start properly legislating and regulating the slave trade. There's this one line in the biography of William Wilberforce where the biographer says that Wilberforce's life was all about making doing good more fashionable, and abolitionism was just a part of that. And for me, that was a big epiphany. It's like, oh, because after I'd finished my last book, for a time I was like, okay, I think that the fight for animal rights is the most important thing in the whole world. I think this is the biggest moral catastrophe. And I was seriously contemplating spending, the next decade on writing a book about the atrocity of factory farming, maybe doing a documentary. And it was really studying the British abolitionist movement that made me realize, hey, maybe there's a way to be more effective, to actually go on a more meta level and try to galvanize a movement around making doing good more fashionable. And then obviously the fight against factory farming will become, one of the essential cause areas here. But we will draw people in not by saying, oh, factory farming is horrible. No, we will draw people in by saying the coolest people work on the biggest problems, and you're invited.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean that's all interesting. Yeah, I think there's a plausible case to be made that by like getting a movement of lots of people trying to do good, that's more effective than like just focusing on any particular problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is. Some of the stuff you had in the book about the abolitionist movement, it did make me a little bit more hopeful for the end of factory farming, because it seems, when you hear about it, I mean, it seems so distant, the possibility that factory farming will be ended in the near future, when, like, you just can't, it's just so hard to convince people to stop paying for, the tortured corpses of animals. Even after you convince them that it's immoral, they just like basically ignore that fact and go on living their life they want. But for most of history, the idea that slavery would ever be ended would have been similarly unthinkable. So the fact that it was able to be ended shows that there actually can be really profound moral transformations in the world, and often brought about by smart, capable, committed activists.
Yeah. And it took so much time and so many disappointments. I mean, of those 12 founders that I mentioned, only one was still alive when slavery was finally abolished across the British Empire. And there are so many impressive moments when you study their memoirs, when, again, they had lost a major political battle. There was this moment in the early 1790s when they really thought it was going to work out. They had these massive consumer boycotts, the biggest petitions ever. It was such a special moment in British politics. But then, the French Revolution started to go nuts, and the whole idea of, political reform became very toxic, and they didn't make it. It was the first vote on abolishing the slave trade, and I think it was 160 votes against 80, or somewhere around that. And then you read in Thomas Clarkson's, one of the main abolitionists, you read in his memoirs about the moment these abolitionists came together. And what they obviously didn't know is what we know, is that, about 15 years later, they would successfully get a law through Parliament to abolish the slave trade, and that Thomas Clarkson was indeed going to see the end of slavery in his lifetime in 1834. And then it's so impressive to read about these people who were like, we're going to keep going. Things seem really dark right now and hopeless. Actually, a government crackdown was starting to happen on activists, and just the width of abolitionism was starting to become enough to get you in prison. But as I said, they kept going, and the perseverance is just, for me, it's deeply inspiring. I was just reading another book about the women's rights movement in the US, and I mean, that's insane. Like, it's a history of failures. It's a history of losing again and again and again and again. Like, they've lost so many referenda. They've been ridiculed so many times. They've been made fun of so many times. And just, they kept going and going and going. So that's what it takes.
Yeah. So one topic that strikes me as needing a significant amount of moral ambition that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, and this is one thing that some EAs have looked at a little bit, but is trying to tackle wild animal suffering. There are many, many, many times more wild animals than even factory farmed animals, and most of them live short lives of intense suffering. Now, of course, wild animal suffering, it's a hard problem to work on. It's hard to know exactly, exactly what to do. But insofar as the status quo is just what has been produced by billions of years of blind Darwinian evolution that's utterly indifferent to the interests of animals. There's reason to think that if were we to be sufficiently ambitious and to put enough effort into it, potentially we could make better of the lives of many wild animals, particularly in the future with more advanced technology. Would you see that as a sort of like important problem to work on?
So Matthew, I'll be honest there. I am deeply confused about this subject. I guess perhaps it's also why I'm not an EA. It's because I'm like not philosophically rigorous enough, or I'm not really willing to bite some bullets. Like, I see the reasoning, like all suffering counts, and why does, a gazelle that's being eaten alive by a lion, why is that suffering less important than a pig in a factory farm, right? And I don't know if there's some way of quantifying it, and indeed of realizing that a lot of the strategies of a lot of wild animals is to have a lot of kids, and then a lot of these kids die horrific deaths. Yeah, that doesn't seem great for their welfare and their happiness. But again, I'm just deeply confused about it. Also with these biodiversity debates, like obviously in the environmental movement and the left, it is a given, it is an absolute dogma that the more diversity we have, the better it is. So when wolves, arrive in the Netherlands, as they recently did, I come from the Netherlands, and start eating sheep, then people on the left are like, this is wonderful. And part of me thinks like, well, I wonder how the sheep think about that. It's probably not very nice to be eaten alive by these wolves. And then I was talking to an effective altruist recently, and he said, half jokingly, I think, but I'm not really sure if he was joking. He said, yeah, we got to pave over nature, right? Nature is evil. Make nature a parking lot. And I was like, I find that very funny. But are you serious? That's a bit disturbing. Look, I guess my position here is I don't know, and I think we there's a lot to be said for doing a lot more rigorous research here into wild animal suffering. I think we've got a lot of work first to do, just stopping our own worst abuses, where factory farming to me seems to be the clearest case. But yeah, when sometimes people start, in my view, pushing things a little bit too far. Like a friend of mine was recently saying, like, Rutger, did you know that factory farming is taking up a lot of land today? So that's about 50% of habitable land. Or I think, no, it's about a third, because it's also, anyway, a lot of land, right? If we abolish factory farming, then we will have an enormous amount of rewilding probably. And there will be much more biodiversity, much more wild animals. But what if these wild animals actually suffer more than all these animals in factory farms? And I guess, yeah, the telling fact about me is just that, I don't know, I plug out. Like I've like, or when people say like, what about the meat eater problem? Like, don't save kids dying from malaria because they will grow up and start eating meat. And another example why I'm not an EA. It's like Joey Savai said this to me, the founder of Charity Entrepreneurship, and maybe it's a cop out, but I like his answer. He said, "Look, in my utopia, there's no malaria, so we're happy eradicating malaria, and then surely there will be other problems after that." And maybe that's also sort of my common sense approach to morality. I'm willing to take a few bets here and there. Like, for example, I'm willing to take the bet that factory farming is one of the greatest moral atrocities of our time. But I'm not like EAs that I'm like, I think the risk appetite, the philosophical risk appetite among a lot of EAs is higher than mine. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I confess. So the thing you were saying about your friend who talked about paving over nature, that's my view. I think, we have to be very cautious. We don't want to, do things that have too long lasting or deleterious effects. But in general, I think most wild animals live quite bad lives. There are about 100 million wild animals that are plausibly conscious for every human. Almost certainly, like all the suffering in factory farmings is a rounding error compared to the suffering in the wild, and all the suffering that humans have is a rounding error compared to the suffering on factory farms. And so in light of this, I'm in favor of trying to reduce the number of wild animals. But I certainly
you would also recognize that you're deeply uncertain about this, right? Because the state
yes.
of the science here is, it's not like physics. It's not like Newtonian laws or anything like that. We're very uncertain still, right? What it's like to be an animal in the wild, and we're pretty certain about the suffering of boiler chickens in factory farming.
Yeah, right. But even so long as you think that like fish are conscious, which I think the evidence is really clear that fish are conscious, and there are just so many fish that probably fish suffering will just dominate everything else, and then plausibly that's even dominated by insect suffering. But anyways, yeah. So I do, given the potential. The potential for like, to think insect suffering. I do see,
Yeah.
the impulse to say, just get off the crazy train, just
Mhm.
stop the torture of animals, stop torturing animals.
So, the crazy train. Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, indeed. I'm jumping off the crazy train probably earlier than you are, and not because I'm like, oh, I'm smarter than you are, or my arguments are better. I'm just like, I'm not interested in going there. Like
So the way I feel about with a lot of this stuff is that I think the reason why it seems crazy to us is not for very good reasons, right? So like the reason it seems crazy to us to like pave over nature is just, because nature, it's so beautiful. We feel an emotional attachment to nature, and we don't spend very much time thinking about what it's like to be a wild animal. But I mean, one intuition pump is, imagine if after you died, you lived the life of every other creature who would ever live. So you would spend roughly 100% of your time as a wild animal. And then considerations about how wild animals' lives go would start to be pretty salient in your mind, I think. Like they would start to even look way more important than human.
Yeah. Now, look, I completely get your point, and like the naturalistic fallacy is one of the the most common mistakes, right? When people think about ethics or morality, just thinking, yeah, it's just natural, so therefore it must be good. Well, maybe this is like the ultimate naturalistic fallacy, just thinking that nature itself is good just because it's beautiful. But again, I'm just I'm confused about it. And I would very much encourage much more scientific research on this question.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. That at this point, like the science of wild animal suffering studies is really in its infancy, and so really at this point, what we should be doing is like researching and figuring out more.
Yeah. And I should say I have also seen some scientists pushing back against it quite strongly. I think I've seen at least one paper saying, yeah, it may be actually net positive. So I don't know, not my expertise.
Yeah. Well, so there are difficult questions about like whether animals live bad lives, right? That's a pretty complicated dispute. I tend to be of the view that I think most of them in the wild do live bad lives. But I think whether you think animals live bad lives or good lives, it seems pretty clear that there's at least a lot of unnecessary suffering in nature. And and just because it's the situations that have led to it, just because they're natural doesn't mean they're worth bringing about. And so like we ideally we should want to reduce the extent of the suffering in nature, even if we think that there's more pleasure than suffering.
Maybe the thing is also that, like, my view is the way to get there, for even to get people to start caring about these questions and being interested in it, we first have to solve the other stuff, right? Like the horror of factory farming is so immense. Like every time I do my homework again, do my reading. Recently I was listening to another podcast with Louis Bollard, the grant maker at Open Philanthropy and one of the most knowledgeable people in this area. And it's just, again and again, it blows me away how obviously evil this system is, and how deeply shocking that anyone who would, spent like 10 minutes or 5 minutes watching the right videos, listening to the right experts, would have to acknowledge that this is so horrific. So let's just try and fix that first, and then let's see what comes after. That's what I mean. This is the point I make in my book, is that in 1840, when there was the first great international conference of the abolitionists, who were celebrating their first major victory, the abolition of slavery across the British Empire, they also had to discuss this question: what are we going to do with all the women in our movement? And after a lot of debate, they said, yeah, they're very welcome to watch from the balconies, but no right to speak and no right to vote. And I think that's probably what's going to happen once we, have this big conference where we celebrate the abolition of factory farming. There's going to be some new thing that some people will realize, oh, damn. Okay, now that's the thing we're going to have to work on.
Yeah, I agree. Like factory farming, like I'm happy about the fact that there are more people focusing on stopping factory farming than on averting wild animal suffering. Because just like in 1830, it was good people were working on trying to combat slavery, not trying to combat like racism writ large or something. Because you got like really, you know, in a society that enslaves Black people, it's very hard to get them concerned about the rest of it. And, you know, really ending factory farming, though very few people seem to be willing to stop eating factory farm meat, really it is very much common sense. Like just the idea that we shouldn't torture animals in like these horrifying like nightmare facilities where they're forced to live in filth and shit, where they're mutilated and horror. Like, I mean, anyone who just like looks at footage of what goes on in factory farms can see the grotesque evil that's going on. Well, with wild animal suffering, it's much weirder. You sort of like to even be in a mindset where you might accept it, you kind of like have to be a little bit philosophically inclined. Definitely we're not going to get to concern about wild animal, like unless we're in the society that already is in agreement that factory farming is a horrifying abomination. We're not going to get any concern about.
Well, here's another thing, Matthew, that's going on. So there's this famous moment, right, in Charles Darwin's life when he confesses that, you know, publishing his work about the theory of evolution felt like confessing a murder. And that's something I often think about. So I just have a pretty positive outlook on life. Like that's how I'm wired. I'm an optimistic guy. For me, it's always glass half full. It's probably something in my genes or upbringing. I don't know what's going on. But that was something I really had to struggle with once I started seeing factory farming as the greatest moral atrocity of our time. Like my worldview shifted quite a bit because I had loved, you know, books by people like Hans Rosling or Steven Pinker. I've made those points myself, like, oh, we're making so much progress in the fight against poverty and child mortality. But then at the very same time, you know, in exactly those decades, we've scaled up factory farming to a degree where you could easily argue that if you include animals in your moral circle, actually the world has become quite a bit worse in the last couple of decades. And now you ask me to acknowledge wild animal suffering as well. And then I'm like, Matthew, look, I want to be a hopeful guy, right? And this feels like you're trying to convince me that the world is actually a very dark place. And that's just, again, this is not some kind of philosophical rational defense, but that's, I guess, why I've intuitively, I just don't want to go down that crazy train because I'm just scared it will end up in a very dark place. And I don't want to live there.
Yeah, that is psychologically understandable. I mean, one kind of one night's practical upshot. Once you care about wild animal suffering, it does look like that's a reason to be optimistic about humans in general, right? So when you take into account, like if you just ignored all wild animal suffering and just took into account factory farming, it would not be at all obvious whether humans have had a positive or negative impact on the world. Just because, you know, we're torturing like hundreds of billions of animals, trillions if you count insects and fish. Once you think that actually for every animal who we've caused to suffer in factory farms, we've prevented like thousands or millions from suffering in nature, then maybe that's a reason to be optimistic about humans and about progress and so on. Now
this is the hilarious point in Will MacAskill's book where he comes to the conclusion: declining biodiversity is great. You know, it's one of the great positive impacts of humans on the world. Let's kill off more animal species. I don't know. I guess I'm also I'm too normie for this stuff, man.
No, I mean it's understandable. I think like, I mean, certainly if you're, you know, leading this kind of like public facing movement where, you know, you're trying to get people on board with just being ambitious with their career, if you believe stuff that's too weird, maybe that would hinder it. So maybe even if wild animal suffering is very important, maybe it's good for people like you, for the people who are like the public face of EA, you know, to you know, just like it was important for the public face of EA, you know, sorry, for the public face of abolitionism not to be Quakers, you know, concerned about wild animal suffering. Like
on the other hand, like that's one thing I found funny when I started talking to some EAs. You know, I got to know people like Toby Ord and Will MacAskill, and they really understand the value of your reputation and your brand, etc. But they don't seem to have a lot of expertise in it necessarily, and have, in my view, a somewhat naive assumption sometimes that you can be someone or try to come across as someone who you're just not. So it's not like you can, I don't know, spend $5 million and then suddenly have a different reputation. Like people will see through you. So that really is my view. EA just got to be EA. Like keep being weird and put the altruism at the center of it, and then EA is going to be fine. Don't let the rationalism also always be the second thing, right? And the altruism is like the foundation you're building on everything. Then EA is going to be wonderful. But don't try to be someone you're just not.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think certainly like, making, doing good, like the important cornerstone of EA. Okay, my last question, because we are getting to roughly the 1 hour mark. So on the back of your book, you're described as one of Europe's premier young thinkers. Do you feel that's a little bit of stolen valor? You're like 40. Some of us we're like we're in our 20s. To us, you seem.
Indeed, I'm 37. I've just shaved off my hair because like it was just not savable anymore. So that's a good point. Sorry, that's my publisher. Yeah. So shall I tell you a funny story about that line of Europe's prominent young thinker, because it tells you something funny about how media works. I don't think I've ever told this anywhere, but it's honestly quite hilarious. So in 2014, I published my first book, Utopia of Realists. At the time, it was called Free Money for Everyone. That was the original Dutch title. And I very much wanted to have a translation into English, because I very much felt that I was in a debate with, the US bloggers that I loved, people like Matthew Iglesias, Dylan Matthews, Ezra Klein. But here I was in my tiny country of the Netherlands, writing in Dutch. So I was lucky enough that I was working at this journalism platform called The Correspondent. And at some point, the editor-in-chief said, like, okay, let's just translate it. So we had a translation. And we were about to self-publish it. And at the time, I was my own PR employee, right? We didn't have a budget for anything. So we wanted to get attention for this book, but everyone was busy. And at some point I realized, okay, well, I got to do it. So I started emailing people like newspapers, and reached out to a couple of people to get a blurb. Some people got really angry. I won't give you any names, but you can really find out who people are if you reach out to them when you're a nobody. That tells you much more about people's characters. I'll tell you something about someone who was super kind and awesome, Steven Pinker. I reached out to him as a nobody from the Netherlands. He read the whole book, liked it, blurbed it, and was super supportive. And even when in my next book, I dunked on him quite strongly, especially his work in Better Angels of Our Nature. He was still super kind, and he wrote a letter of recommendation for me when I was applying for my O1 visa to come to the US. So anyway, you learn a lot about people. As I said, I was my own PR employee. So at some point, we also had to write a biography, like who the fuck is Rutger Bregman? And I was like, okay, what's the biography? And like my publisher said, like thinker, young thinker, but like young thinker from what? From the Netherlands. And I was pretty prominent in the Netherlands at the time. Like a lot of people would know me. We could say like young prominent thinker in the Netherlands. But then we're like, could we say Europe? Well, probably Europe. Could work probably. Like what are other young prominent thinkers in Europe? And we honestly couldn't come up with anyone. So we're like, one of the most prominent young thinkers in Europe. That sounds good. Okay, so we put that on the back cover, and then now you can actually go to my Wikipedia page right now. Let me do that. And what you will see is that it has. He has been described by The Guardian as the Dutch wonderkind of new ideas, and by TED Talks as one of Europe's most prominent young thinkers. That's actually my line. But it's just that at some point when I did a tech talk, TED was looking for a bio, and they just used the bio that we created at the time when it was still a self-published book, and we had to come up with something. So anyway, that's how things work sometimes in this world.
Yeah, that's pretty funny.
But I'm not young anymore. We'll stop. We'll get that out.
Well, I think 37, like. I feel like that's sort of borderline,
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. But Yeah, I do remember. I remember when I was in middle school, I saw your TED talk, and I remember talking to many people about. I was at least somewhat convinced to be on board with the UBI. I think I oscillated about it a bit, but I do remember having lots of conversations in middle school about the UBI.
Yeah. Well, UBI is just like libertarianism. You know, it's especially when you're young, these ideas that seem to solve everything, they're very appealing. Then you're like, oh, I've discovered it. Free will doesn't exist. UBI will solve everything. Libertarianism, right? And then most of us, as we get older, you know, we're still interested in those ideas, but it's not the solution to all of our problems anymore.
Yeah. All right, so we're at roughly the 1 hour mark, so I think seems like a good time to wrap up. Thanks so much for coming on. This has been, I think, a really interesting conversation with one of Europe's prominent young thinkers.
Most prominent young thinkers.
One of Europe's most prominent young thinkers. That's right. Yeah. Any last words?
No, thanks for having me, Matthew. I appreciate your work, and keep going.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I guess I'll end the recording.